Hello, all. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Mackenzie Schumann. I am a reporter for the Tribune in San Luis Obispo. Welcome to our live Q&A discussion about offshore wind energy on California's Central Coast. Before we get started with our panel discussion, I'm going to present a slideshow just going through some of the history and basics of offshore wind here. It'll be short, and as soon as it's over, I'll introduce our guests and we'll begin the Q&A. So if we can get that slideshow. Perfect. Okay, so why are we here today? A 376 square mile area of the Pacific Ocean near Cambria and San Simeon could be developed to house enough floating wind turbines to produce 2.9 gigawatts of electricity that would help California and the United States reach its clean energy goals. So how did we get here today? First, let's go over some terms you're going to hear today. To start off, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, is the federal agency within the Department of the Interior that is responsible for managing the development of our offshore resources, including oil, gas, and renewable energy. A wind energy area, or WEA, is an area that BOEM has determined is potentially suitable for commercial wind energy development. The Morro Bay Wind Energy Area is the area where BOEM has determined offshore wind can be developed on the Central Coast. Although it carries the Morro Bay name, it's closer to Cambria and San Simeon. So the story of offshore wind here began in 2016 when Washington state-based Trident Winds applied for a lease from BOEM to develop an area of the Pacific Ocean for offshore wind energy. But before moving forward, BOEM first had to determine whether there were any other companies that might also be interested. At the time, one other company said it was. So BOEM was able to start the long planning process, identify possible locations, and solicit stakeholder feedback. So offshore wind energy is not necessarily a new concept. The world's first offshore wind farm was installed off Denmark's coast in 1991. And in 2009, the first full-scale floating wind turbine began operation off Norway's coast. As of 2020, Europe had a total of 25 gigawatts of offshore wind energy capacity, with more on the way. To put that in perspective, currently the United States only has about 30 megawatts of offshore wind energy in production, albeit with much more in the works. The existing U.S. turbines, and most of those in Europe, are fixed bottom because they're located in shallow waters. The deep waters off the Central Coast, however, require floating turbines. A second proposal off Humboldt County also calls for floating turbines in deep waters, but it's at about half the size of the current Morro Bay proposal. So here on the Central Coast, BOEM's efforts to officially lease an area of the Pacific Ocean for offshore wind hit some snags early in the process. Around 2016, as BOEM was drawing up potential lease areas, the Department of Defense raised concerns that the turbines would interfere with its military training operations, notably off the coast of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, where the DoD conducts live fire training exercises, so that area was removed from consideration. Over the next few years of negotiations with local, state, and federal officials, the DoD wavered back and forth between accepting and opposing the wind farms. So finally, in late 2020, the Navy committed to working with the government to find an acceptable spot for wind turbines off the Central Coast. Then in March of this year, the Biden administration officials pledged to develop 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy in the United States by 2030, adding momentum to the effort. 2 months later, the DoD and federal and state agencies announced they had come to an agreement for the so-called Morro Bay 399 area, which would encompass 399 square miles of the Pacific Ocean. So after some recent changes, the official Morro Bay wind energy area covers 240,898 acres, or 376 square miles. To put that into perspective, that area is about 1/10 the size of San Luis Obispo County, or about 2 Lake Tahoes. The wind energy area is located at its closest point about 20 miles off the coast of Cambria. So now BOEM has begun to conduct an environmental assessment, a process that's open to public comment. After the panel discussion, we'll tell you how you can join that conversation and share your thoughts. So there's a lot of support for bringing offshore wind to the Central Coast. Some of the primary reasons include helping the state and country reach clean energy targets, and providing the Central Coast with long-term jobs and revenue. But there's also plenty of opposition. For example, fishermen are worried about the turbine's impact on their fishing grounds. Environmental groups wonder about impacts on birds, whales, fish, bats, and other marine life. And many Cambria and San Simeon residents fear the floating wind farm will ruin their pristine views. Of course, we'll talk about this during our panel discussion. And so that concludes my brief presentation. If you want to have a copy of this presentation, because I know it went pretty quick, my email should be on your screen. And so now I'd like to introduce our panel. So our first panelist is Doug Boren. He's the Pacific Regional Director for BOEM and is overseeing the potential Morro Bay offshore wind energy development for the agency. Second, we have Central Coast Congressman Salud Carbajal. He's represented District 24 since 2017 and has been heavily involved in negotiations to bring offshore wind to our coast. Karen Douglas was appointed to the California Energy Commission in 2008 and is the agency's lead on developing and planning for offshore wind here. Melissa James is the president and CEO of REACH, a local organization that works to bring economic opportunity and prosperity to the Central Coast. And Ben Ruttenberg is an associate professor and the director of Cal Poly Center for Coastal Marine Sciences. So thank you all so much again for being here with us today. And with that, I'm going to kick off our discussion. So I'll be asking some questions for myself, as well as some questions that I received from RSVPs throughout the week. And those are questions from locals primarily. And we'll also be taking some live questions off of Facebook and YouTube, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the event. All right. So, and Congressman, I understand because you have to leave at 1:15, we're going to try to get to some of your questions in the beginning.
Great.
Yeah. That being said, though, I am going to start it off. My first question is for Doug. So I'm wondering, why our coast? Why the Central Coast? What are the top reasons for bringing this, like what makes the Central Coast attractive for this massive development?
And I'll just say, thanks for having me here, Mackenzie, and great presentation. That was a pretty good summation of the things so far. So good job on that. I'll just say the Central Coast really has a couple of things working for it. One of the things is that the wind resource is good. The Central Coast area, has some good winds that can support, an economic project moving forward. The Central Coast also brings, with the Morro Bay Power Plant, the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant, some existing transmission infrastructure that's there that, for these projects to have, access to the grid so they can sell the power. So that's one of the attractive things that is on the Central Coast too. And just to give an example, BOEM has no leasing authority within the sanctuaries. So, there is the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which is kind of the northern border of where we're looking at the Central Coast, and south of where we're looking at in the Morro Bay area, the wind just isn't as good. So I think there's a lot of things working there. The Central Coast is looking good as far as, from a technical aspects. And, so that I think that's why, when Tribune, when they first submitted their proposal in 2016, it was one of the areas that they picked. And after we went through the process, we agreed, in partnership with the state that the Central Coast was a good area for offshore wind development, potentially.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And kind of a follow-up to that, I actually have a question from someone named Joe Benson in San Luis Obispo. They're wondering, does the Central Coast have any advantages over the site in Humboldt County?
I guess it depends on what advantages are. One of the, and if we're talking, if it's going to be developed or, if it's going to be economic, I think the transmission infrastructure onshore is an advantage for the Central Coast. The Central Coast is maybe a little closer to some port infrastructure that can support the project. But that's not to say that, there's not advantages for the North Coast too. So the Humboldt site is looking good, although on the North Coast, there is a need for more transmission development to get that power to the grid.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. This next question is for Karen. We hear a lot of the development, or we hear a lot that this development will produce nearly 3 gigawatts of electricity. So can you put that into perspective for people. What does that mean? What does that mean for our electricity grid and powering our homes?
So thank you for the question. Just quickly stepping back for a minute to Central Coast and what some of the advantages are. I just wanted to say that in the near term, as we look at projects that could come online and produce a significant amount of electricity around on or by or around 2030, it's really Central Coast that has that opportunity to get to that kind of scale quickly, the 3 gigawatt scale in that nearer time frame because of the existing transmission infrastructure right there on the Central Coast. And so that's why, even though it was a real effort to negotiate and work through the military compatibility issues and the other just conversations and issues to get to that wind energy area on the Central Coast, it was really important to do so. The North Coast has tremendous potential, but a much smaller current market. And so, as Doug said, we're going to need to do some real work to find ways to export, if we were to export significant amounts of offshore wind from the Humboldt area. And the Energy Commission is called upon to look at that full suite of issues in AB 525, the strategic plan for offshore wind. In terms of the 3 gigawatts, I'm going to send a note to our communications team to help translate that into, sometimes we translate it into number of houses or communities the size of X or Y. I don't have that at my fingertips, but it's a good question. I'll just say 3 gigawatts is a large amount of electricity, and it would represent a really substantial project and step forward as we look at meeting our goals. We have, though, in the state, very significant renewable energy and climate goals, and we're looking at a very significant scale up of solar, of storage, onshore resources, out-of-state resources, and in the broad statewide modeling that we did, we allowed the model to consider up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and the model wanted all 10 gigawatts of offshore wind. So it's very clear that offshore wind could play an important role in meeting our goals and in helping us meet those goals cost effectively, at least when you look at the mix of resources that could help us get there.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of a follow-up to that, I want to throw this to Ben. Because this is wind energy, I understand that there's a Cal Poly study about this and how just the fact that it's wind, it may not always be blowing, but it seems to be blowing at the right time. I mean, can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And I first want to recognize the team at Cal Poly that includes Yihui Wang, who's been the primary analyst who's done a lot of this work, as well as Crow White, Ryan Walter, and Steve Hamilton, plus a whole bunch of students that have been involved in this project. So thanks to all of them for participating and helping make this project a success. So some of the work that we've done is looking at potential power production, and not just the amount, but also the timing of when that power is produced. And one of the interesting things about offshore wind energy from the analyses that we've done is that it looks like power production actually starts to increase in the late afternoons and early evenings, particularly in the spring and summer. You know, right around the time that solar production starts to kick off as the sun goes down. You know, pre-pandemic, you know, we'd all go out to work, come home in the late afternoon, get home and flip on a whole bunch of appliances, you know, really increasing that demand for electricity. So conveniently, looks like that offshore wind energy power production actually increases around that time. That should help us meet some of that gap that we see, at least with respect to other renewables like solar.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And so kind of bouncing around to another topic, this question is for Congressman Carbajal, and perhaps Karen, you can weigh in as well. There's been a lot of news recently about the decommissioning of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. Given that it's currently still scheduled to go fully offline in 2025, will the offshore wind energy be here in time to replace it?
Well,
The timing is a big question, and I will defer somewhat to Boehm, Doug, to let us know what the estimated timeline looks like. But for me, I see this as a sense of urgency in light of the decommissioning coming, it being initiated in 2024 and 2025 when it commences. We need to move as fast as we can with a sense of urgency, not only to make sure that we mitigate some of those jobs, but to address the climate crisis and to make sure that we are meeting our state and federal goals for renewable energy. Look, we've become dependent on fossil fuels, and it's going to be a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. But we need to have a sense of urgency because the climate crisis is an urgent matter, and the decommissioning is an urgent matter. So I believe we need to do everything possible to move forward expeditiously. And I'm doing everything I can, certainly with the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act that the president signed this Monday, with the Build Back Better Act that the House approved today and will now go to the Senate. There are major transformational investments to address climate change and to invest in renewable energy infrastructure. So I'm confident that the groundwork has been laid to get us moving, and the momentum is here with us. So we just need to take advantage of that.
Yeah, thank you. And Doug, if you want to weigh in on that timeline, or Karen as well.
I can say from a Boehm perspective is, we have a timeline and we're moving to a lease sale in fall of 2022. We expect to meet that timeline. As far as things after that, some of it's out of our hands, but, the Boehm team and on the federal government side, we're making sure that, we're looking at things so that we can look at these, at the projects that come in, making sure that we get full coverage from the environmental review side, but making it as efficient as possible so that we can, meet some of these timelines. I'll just remind everyone that, one of the administration's goals is, 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And, that's East Coast and West Coast. So there's a lot of, ways we're looking to improve efficiency so that we can meet that goal for the administration.
Mackenzie, I might just add a few things. I completely agree with the congressman on the sense of urgency here, and we're feeling that across the board in California and beyond. When, from my vantage point on the Energy Commission, we are seeing, we're in the middle of an energy transition. We're also in the middle of a climate crisis where we're seeing impacts in terms of heat waves, impacts in terms of wildfires, and how that affects the transmission system. The electricity system is changing. We're dealing with climate impacts, and we're looking at a transformation in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the where we get our energy. And so as we think about the upcoming decommissioning of Diablo Canyon, that will remove electricity from our grid. And of course, it is carbon-free electricity. So from the state level, we're looking hard at just making sure that we have projects in line to provide the reliability and the California needs, and also keep us on a path to meeting our greenhouse gas and climate goals. My sense of the BOEM process, and as we've worked and partnered with BOEM, I don't think our expectation is that renewable energy from offshore wind farms would be there to immediately replace the Diablo Canyon resource. But Doug can speak up if he sees the timeline differently, because we are moving this forward as fast as we reasonably can, while also obviously having an inclusive process and talking to stakeholders and looking at environmental impacts and trying to do a really solid job all around. So we are, I think that even though we're probably looking further out than 2025, 2026 for offshore wind farms to be producing electricity into the grid, I do think that we have the opportunity to see some of the benefits from the startup of the offshore wind industry and from some of the upgrades in infrastructure or investments in supply chain to occur in advance of projects obviously operating. And so one of the things that we really are looking hard at is, when do key things have to happen for this industry to move forward? And then what does that mean in communities and for jobs and for job training and for investment timelines?
Yeah, and thank you for that. That actually kind of brings me directly to my next question for Melissa. So Reach recently released an economic study that showed development of the offshore wind on the Central Coast could bring hundreds of jobs, like millions in economic benefits and so forth. Can you explain a little bit more behind that, about these jobs, the number of jobs, whether they'll be short-term, permanent, maybe some workforce training needs? Can you help elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mackenzie, and to the Tribune. I'm really grateful for this conversation happening here at the community level. There's obviously a lot of discussion at the state and federal level about the energy transition. And, we at Reach, working at the intersection of community, really wanted to understand, what does this big, global conversation mean to us here on the Central Coast? We know we have impacts of the energy transition with Diablo closing and some of our oil refineries closing as we make that transition to renewables. And we wanted to understand, what does that mean? So the economic impact study that you referenced, we commissioned from Cal Poly. They did the research behind it. And what we learned is that the jobs and economic impact associated with the offshore wind industry is going to, it takes place onshore at some sort of a kind of renewable energy port. You see this in Europe, you see this in the East Coast as they're doing planning to deploy offshore wind. And really what it comes down to is, if we have about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind, and we have jobs, associated with that, it's about 262 million in annual economic impact and approximately 650 jobs, paying about 90,000 a year, just for the ongoing operations and maintenance of the offshore wind industry. But the important caveat to that we learned within the study is that those jobs show up every day on land initially, before they're making their way out to operate and maintain the offshore wind farm at some sort of a clean energy port. And so there's been some discussion here within our region about how we can add to the supporting infrastructure with urgency to meet the offshore wind goals that we have for 3 gigawatts. So we already know we have the transmission infrastructure. We already know that we have a site that has been identified as premier for offshore wind development. And then we know that we also have an energy workforce here on the Central Coast that has been working in the industry for a long time with the skills to transition and be a part of a new future industry. So that's some of what the study looked at. And I think to put those numbers in comparison, it's on par with Diablo, the annual economic impact being a little more than what Diablo generates annually. The jobs generation is a little bit less. The economic benefit through taxes is about the same as well. So when you think about the opportunity that offshore wind could have to the Central Coast in terms of jobs and economic benefit, it's significant. There's certainly some steps we need to take as a community in partnership with the state and federal government to realize those opportunities here.
Yeah, thank you. And so, Melissa, I also kind of want to bounce it back to you, and then Congressman Carvajal, if you're able to add as well. Can you, Melissa, you mentioned the wind port. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is exactly? Where would it go? Would it be Morro Bay, Pismo, maybe Monterey? Is there any ideas upon that kind of thing right now?
Well, yeah. I think Melissa, go ahead. You probably could give a better answer, but I know there's a feasibility study that's being kicked around that would be essential and imperative to understand if we have a place where such a port could be sited. But you might add more to that, Melissa.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I would say what the congressman has shared is exactly right. The question that we have, the one that you have, Mackenzie, is on the top of everyone's mind. Well, where would such a port go? And the answer to that question has to be done through rigorous technical and feasibility analysis to really be able to understand that. So it's a research question that we have, and there is a bipartisan coalition of community leaders that are behind seeing that feasibility study done. So the congressman is at the forefront of that, our local assemblyman, our senator, the county board of supervisors in June passed a resolution saying we want to support the offshore wind industry into our region, and we want to see this feasibility study conducted so that we can understand in our community, is there something that we should be doing to help deploy offshore wind off our coast? So the feasibility study for a clean energy port is the first step in that process. And what we've seen, looking at the East Coast, who's a little ahead of us here on the West Coast, there you see in national news all the time the investments that are being made into port infrastructure. And what we're seeing is that it's really a network of ports that are supporting the development of an industry. And what we're looking at now, and I should say, the state and federal government, is what is the port infrastructure that we have on our coastline? How can that be utilized? Where are the gaps? Where do we need to invest and develop more infrastructure to support that? And I'd say from the community perspective, we're saying we want to be a part of this kind of clean energy revolution and offshore wind. And if there's something that we can be doing on the infrastructure side to support the deployment and to bring jobs and economic opportunity to our region, we want to do that.
And Mackenzie, if I could add to that, the way I see it is these are two complementary concurrent efforts. One is to bring about offshore wind energy, and the second one is the positive impact that offshore wind energy projects could be multiplied if we have such a port. So that's why first we need to move that energy forward, no matter what, whether we have a port or not. But if we can have a port, the studies that have been done that Melissa alluded to have stipulated that the economic positive impact to our region would be multifold because of that port. The supply chain, the economic activity, the jobs would increase. So that's why it's important to move both of those efforts concurrently forward in terms of the feasibility study to see if such a port can be sited in this area, and to continue to work aggressively on moving forward with offshore wind.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of adding to that, Deb Addis from Cambria asked, what is the cost to taxpayers for this, for construction of a wind port, for the feasibility studies that have to be done? How much are locals going to have to foot the bill, essentially, for this?
I would just say that I think the federal government certainly can provide investments in this area, but it's probably looking at a multi-jurisdictional investment where the locals are going to have to look at what's entailed to be able to bring about such a port. Is it a joint authority? Is it whatever the infrastructure is in terms of an organization? That has to be determined by the local community. Now, the federal government, as the state government, no doubt will have resources, as I mentioned earlier, through the recent pieces of legislation that we move forward. There will be resources to assist in this effort. But I don't want to give anybody the impression that this port would be built by all federal or state resources. I think it's going to be a combination of everybody stepping up. And that's assuming that it's feasible and deemed feasible through the study.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so we're talking a lot about, obviously, the economic benefit that this may have on our local community and so forth. But I want to bounce it back to Ben. I understand you've been doing some research on the local fishing industry, which contributes more than $9 million to our local economy, and how they may be impacted. Can you explain a little bit about the research you're doing right now, the data you're gathering regarding that?
Sure. Thanks, Mackenzie. That's a great question. Certainly, there's been a lot of interest, in offshore in these areas, and there's some concern that some of these areas, if a wind farm is put in, it would effectively exclude fishing activity. Now, again, whether that happens or doesn't happen, I'm not really sure, but if we go on that assumption, there's likely to be some impact to the fishing community. And so what our group has been doing is pulling a whole bunch of fishing data together. And right now we're really focused on two primary data sets. One are what we call the landings receipts. Basically, anytime a commercial fishing operation goes and lands catch at a port, say Morro Bay or Port St. Louis, and they sell that to a processor, that generates a landing receipt with the species that they caught and the amount of the fish that they caught. We're now combining that with a second data set that's called a vessel monitoring system, which is essentially like a GPS on individual fishing vessels. That vessel monitoring system, the GPS is required on vessels that are fishing for ground fish, basically fish that hang out near the bottom in federal water. So anything outside of 3 nautical miles, those areas that the federal government manages. And so we're combining these two data sets to try to really get a sense of not just where boats are active from that GPS, that VMS data, but also what they're catching when they're there. So we're still very much in the midst of this, working through some of these analyses. But the emphasis of our research is trying to understand what activity might be happening inside these call areas, both down here in the Morro Bay, the new Morro Bay 399 call area, and in the Humboldt Bay call area, relative to the general fishing activity that's happening. So one of the things that are, again, these results are very, very preliminary. But our results seem to suggest that there's a reasonable amount of fishing activity that's happening inside that Humboldt call area. It might be as much as 10% or more of the ground fish, these bottom fish that are landed in the Humboldt Bay ports. Down here, it looks like there's probably less of that activity happening inside that Morro Bay call area. Again, we're still not sure exactly how much, but it's likely much less than that. So down here, it looks like, again, from these preliminary analyses, that those impacts to fishing operations here are likely to be lower than they are up in Humboldt Bay. But it's really important to note that right now we are only capturing kind of a subset of these data sets. Right, we only have these two data sets. There are some other data streams that are potentially out there that we don't have access to yet. But the one thing we are capturing, we're getting about 85% of the total landings in these ground fish fisheries. Again, these are the fisheries that are happening in federal waters, likely in these deeper areas where the call areas are going to go. So I think we're capturing a reasonable amount of that activity that's happening out there.
Yeah, interesting. So there is some fishing activity, obviously, that happens in that call area. And I'm wondering if Doug or Congressman Carbajal can address this next question of what happens when turbines, I know this is still far in the future, but what happens if those turbines are built, and will fishermen lose their livelihoods? Is there going to be any sort of compensation for them?
So Melissa, I'm sorry to just quickly jump in. This is Commissioner Douglas, but I wanted to just speak on the fishing outreach question as well, which is that the state is partnering with BOEM on fishing outreach and has been for quite a while, really, but especially recently. And we completely understand that there needs to be a dialogue with the fishing industry and with the people who know that industry the best and are participating and relying on it. And in fact, we have some meetings coming up in the end of November that are going to be between state agencies and BOEM and the commercial fishermen. So and limited to them, but we are doing this outreach. That outreach is really important. If anyone listening who is part of the fishing industry and may not know about outreach meetings wants to attend, you can reach out to either me or it's really Chris Potter at the Department of Fish and Wildlife who's pulling these together, and I can provide information to Mackenzie so that she can connect people. But this outreach is really important. There are models for how to assess impacts and how to understand impacts. I think the point that Ben made about, starting with data and starting with really understanding what's going on and what the impacts are is a very valuable and helpful one. And I think this is going to be an ongoing dialogue as this process moves forward. I just wanted to maybe take us back for 2 seconds on ports too, to say that we agree with the sentiments expressed. I think that as the Congressman mentioned, there's a lot of interest that the ports analysis be done and done well. And I think that there is a lot of ability to do that. So we'll look forward to following up on both of those areas.
Mackenzie, as you also directed your question at me, let me just share that I've had a number of meetings with the area fishermen, and I'm encouraged that they have been very forthcoming with their concerns. And I'm also encouraged that they were able to reach an agreement with Trident when they were considering what that project might look like and what kind of mitigations they feel would be fair. And so I think there's a blueprint for moving forward, not only to address impacts during the environmental assessment process, but ultimately the successful companies in moving forward will continue to have those dialogues and those negotiations also with our local fishermen to reach a win-win. So I'm confident that as long as we have a very public and transparent process and a good engagement process, we will reach a good positive outcome that'll be a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mackenzie, sorry, I think that, I've got to throw in too, and this kind of builds on both the Congressman and Commissioner Douglas is, just at the national level, BOEM is developing guidance to mitigate potential impacts from offshore wind projects on commercial and recreational fisheries and fishing. As part of this effort, BOEM will host a series of workshops in early December to solicit input from the fishing community and developers that would inform the draft guidance on fisheries mitigation. Topics to consider include project siting, design, navigation, and of course, financial compensation. I can say that there is a workshop for the West Coast fishing community. It's scheduled for December 13th, and it's from 10 to 12. And, that announcement will be going out soon if it hasn't gone out already. So thank you.
Yeah, that's good to know how people here can get involved and share their public opinion and so forth. So thank you for that. And Doug, that actually does bring me to my next question for you. I'm wondering, before I begin my next few questions, I want to ask what exactly is happening now with the environmental assessment. What exactly are you looking at? What are you assessing currently?
I'll just say that we're in the beginning of the process. So when we announced the wind energy area last Friday, it did start our scoping process. So right now we're in the 60-day scoping period where we're soliciting comments from the public. And, those comments are intended to, guide us as to what we need to make sure that we cover in that NEPA document going forward. And I'll say the scoping period is open and it closes on January 11th. So it's out there for comments from the public, and that will, like I said, will provide input into us to make sure we're covering the right things in our NEPA document.
Okay, that makes sense. And so my next question is for Congressman Carbajal and perhaps Doug as well, if you want to weigh in. It's a bit of a two-parter. So can you explain the relationship between the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary and the proposed offshore wind energy? I think many people might not know that a chunk of the sanctuary was cut to make room for the wind energy area. So I'm just wondering, how did that happen? If Congressman, you can go first.
Well, I think there's been a number of discussions over the years, but at this point in time, the boundaries that will be further finalized seem to be outside of the area that is being considered for offshore wind. So we have two, again, concurrent efforts that are separate and will have, in some sense, similar and in some in much a very different goal. But at the end of the day, I think you're going to have protections that the fishermen are going to appreciate, that will be included in the Chumash Marine Sanctuary. And again, this also provides the Department of Defense some assurances, because if you might recall, they're concerned that while they are now working in good faith to realize the square footage where we will be able to move forward with renewable energy farms and projects, they're concerned that their training and readiness and testing area not be eviscerated for their needs. So they are actually ecstatic that the Marine Sanctuary, the Chumash Marine Sanctuary, actually in some way also not only protects the environment and will define its uses, but also protects from further encroachment in their testing area as well.
Thanks, Congressman. And I'll just add that, I think it shows the great partnership that we have at the federal level, and that this administration, because both are priorities, offshore wind is definitely a priority of the administration, needing it to move forward to help, combat the effects of climate change, at the same time, conservation. And I think the, Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary proposal moving forward, adjacent to the Morro Bay wind energy area, shows that, this is important to the administration, both aspects, the conservation side of the sanctuary, as well as, the offshore wind and the renewable energy development for those to fight the effects of climate change, which we know here in California is very real for us.
Yeah, thank you. And so I want to bounce it back to Ben. This is a question from Lydia Morenza from San Luis Obispo. And she was wondering how you may be studying how the project could affect whale migration, elephant seal habitat, and what other marine life these turbines, whatever marine life these turbines could impact.
Yeah, that's another great question, and something that's really important for us to be thinking about. And as Doug alluded to in this NEPA process, a lot of that, my understanding, is going to get folded into that as well. Trying to understand those impacts off of our coast obviously are really difficult. You're talking about waters that are pretty far offshore, in very deep water. And without any analogs out here, it's hard to really understand what those are. That said, a couple of years ago, we embarked on a study that was led by a great Cal Poly undergrad named Haley Farr, to try to understand what some of those environmental impacts might be. And, in general, it looks like many of those environmental impacts from floating wind farms are likely to be pretty minor. So you mentioned things like, whales, and a lot of people are concerned about whale strikes and whale entanglements. Those cables that are going to attach these turbines that are floating to the seafloor are going to be, very, very large, huge, thick steel cables that are likely to be very, very taut. So it seems very unlikely that marine mammals are going to get tangled up in those cables themselves. It's of course possible that, some derelict fishing gear might get, some nets or something might get hung up on the cables, those attachment cables themselves, and then, attach and entangle marine mammals. Or a marine mammal that's already got some gear on it might get tangled up on those cables. But it seems like those are, relatively unlikely events. And again, with, if we have appropriate monitoring of these areas with hydrophones or cameras, we might be able to detect some of those events, at least to be able to quantify how much of an impact those are. Again, it's important to note that as far as I understand, there's not a whole lot of data from other places on these. Things like disturbance to the seabed is also something that people have expressed some concern about. And again, we think those impacts are likely to be pretty minor. The anchors, these huge, massive concrete anchors that are going to dig into the seafloor. And so obviously where those things land, clearly they're going to impact whatever happened to be living there. But you're talking about a very, very small area in a huge expanse of seafloor. And so, thinking about it from the sort of the population level, we think it's very unlikely to have any significant or substantive impacts on those animals. The other thing there may actually be some positive effects of these devices as well. Things what we call a reef effect. If you put hard bottom or hard habitat in an area of soft bottom, it often tends to attract lots of invertebrates and fish to it. So you may actually increase some of the populations as well. And also we know from lots of studies that fish do like to hang around floating structures. So by putting some of these turbines in, you might actually increase some of the populations of fish nearby. So there's other things like electromagnetic fields, that the transmission cables might generate some electromagnetic fields, but the work that we've been able to do so far suggests that those are likely to be very, very localized, probably in the, tens of meters or even less. So, 30 to 50 feet or possibly even less. So a very, very small area of the ocean that these are going to impact. Obviously, there's a whole lot more. We could talk probably for an hour and a half just about the environmental impacts. So I'll leave it for there unless there are more specific questions.
Well, yeah, I have one sort of additional specific question. This comes from Stacy Hunt from Los Osos. She's wondering specifically if new technologies will be used to reduce bird strikes. You kind of mentioned this a bit, just about those mitigation technologies that may help our marine life essentially not die around these turbines.
Right. Yeah, that's another great question. And there was huge concern when land turbines went, initially turbines were put on land about the number of birds that were killed by these turbines. And over time, the turbine design has actually has worked to reduce those impacts. Those turbines have gotten bigger, the blades have gotten longer, and they spin more slowly, making them much easier for terrestrial birds to avoid. There's some preliminary work that suggests that seabirds may actually be able to avoid these areas much more effectively than land birds had in the past. So it's possible that impacts to seabirds might actually be lower. There's several other aspects. These things are also going to be very, very far out to sea. So it may be that birds are able to avoid the areas altogether, and the distance from the sea surface to the bottom of the turbine blades are likely to be, at least 50 or 60 feet, if not more, depending on the size of the turbine. So there should be plenty of space for those birds to swim through or to fly through those areas. And of course, thinking about new technologies, one of the things that that we're really excited about is the potential to actually start to generate some of the data that we don't have. And so things like new camera technology combined with artificial intelligence might help us to better be able to detect when some of these organisms are present, things like seabirds, and what those impacts might be. So we would strongly advocate for some really substantive work in monitoring to really try to understand what the potential impacts are in a place, and again, thinking about how we might use technology to try to mitigate them.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting to follow that research and what comes forward. And I've actually, while this has been happening, I've gotten a few emails and they're for Melissa specifically. And I'm wondering, some of her viewers are locals and they're worried particularly about how this is going to impact their homes, their jobs, their livelihoods, and so forth. And so I'm wondering if you can address how tangible this would be for local communities such as Morro Bay, Pismo, Avila, Cambria, San Simeon, all of these really small local communities. What is the job outlook for these communities locally? Are we going to see workers commuting in from LA or commuting in from San Francisco, or are we going to see local jobs and local revenue? And I know you addressed that a bit in your feasibility study that you talked about earlier, but I'm wondering if you can address particularly the very local concerns that we have here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely not an expert in the energy industry, but I would say that my day-to-day job, what I wake up every day to do, is to ensure that our locals have jobs and opportunity here on the Central Coast. Our organization was formed in large part out of the announced closure of Diablo and the impacts that would have to jobs and opportunity and the need for our region to reinvent and make sure that there is a pipeline of jobs and opportunities. So as we think about offshore wind and the benefit that it may or may not have to our locals, it's a really important question. And a lot of the dialogue here is a big part of that, where the infrastructure is going to be and how the offshore wind farms are going to be deployed all maps back into where those jobs and opportunities may come from. So I would say, as an example, you think about how the offshore winds are going to be built and constructed. We're going to have component parts that are going to come onshore to some sort of a port. They will be assembled and deployed, out into the offshore wind farm. There will be maintenance technicians and operators that will, be making sure to service them and make sure that they're up and running, day to day in perpetuity, for many, many years. Those are the types of jobs that you can see kind of taking place. But the important part of the question is similar to what I shared before, is those jobs will suit up each day and show up at some sort of a port where they will be deployed. So the question about how those jobs map in from our local regional kind of economy is directly connected to the supporting infrastructure. So one of the things that we're doing at REACH is we're partnering with the state and a high roads training partnership grant to map out what the workforce development program would be for the Central Coast and how we map in those jobs. And in parallel, the feasibility study for where that infrastructure will take place. Those two things kind of happen in tandem. So I'd say our goal, what we'd want to see, is that we would have the enabling infrastructure for the offshore wind that would allow jobs and opportunity for our locals to show up each day, both from an assembling, operating, maintaining the offshore wind farms. But as you think about as the technology and the industry matures over time, the goal would be that we would see a strengthened supply chain within our region and a spinoff of all different types of jobs. So a couple of examples might be, and we've heard from different folks in these kind of realms, but someone has reached out recently that 3D prints component parts and they want to do that at a port. Or we've heard from people who have kind of underwater drones, that type of technology that will be able to monitor the infrastructure and the transmission cables. So as you see the industry start to take shape here, there's many different spin-off opportunities that we would love to see the Central Coast be a part of.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And so it seems like there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and I got a question from, let me see if I can find it again, from someone who sent me an email at some time, but they asked essentially what agency or agencies or entities are going to be overseeing this kind of economic opportunity and so forth. Like, is this a one agency approach? Is this an all government? And if, can you explain the differences between those two? And I'm not sure exactly who this would be directed to, perhaps Doug or Melissa or Karen.
I can share a little bit, and then Doug and Karen and the congressman, I'm sure everybody has a part to play. There's no one agency for certain. We definitely, we have two different agencies represented on this panel from the state and the federal government. So I know from a regulatory perspective, there's multiple agencies that are involved at the state and federal level. On the workforce side of things, there's agencies involved at the state and federal level as well. And then we have our local county in San Luis Obispo that's involved. So it's, the challenge and the opportunity for us as a new industry is being cultivated off the coast of California is how to collaborate and communicate and coordinate across many different agencies and jurisdictions to get to the end goal.
I will just say from the federal government, in terms of funding and revenues that are made available to assist with, for instance, the local port, there's always opportunities for project labor agreements to make sure that you are helping the local trades labor force, that you're giving preference to regional individuals that live, regional residents, instead of outside folks who might want to come in for these jobs. So give a priority to local residents for these jobs, I think is essential. But as Melissa said, when it comes to the private companies that will be moving forward these wind farms, they are private companies. So working with them collaboratively to make sure that these projects include local hires provisions is really important. When it comes to the ports, you heard President Biden say a lot of the resources for infrastructure that move forward were with the intent to really provide for good local union jobs. So those are some essential things to consider in whatever happens with moving these two efforts forward.
And I'll just jump in because I appreciate what the congressman just noted there. And I want to just underscore it. As we think about the closure of Diablo, there's many of those types of jobs from our local trades and labor folks that are going to be, losing out on work. But what a great opportunity to be building in the opportunities for them in a new industry that's being cultivated. And I think that's exactly the goals that are being expressed at the state and federal level. And we want to do what we can on the local level to see that happen.
So I'll just add in here as well, in terms of who is doing what from an agency perspective. The Energy Commission does not have a regulatory role. We don't approve projects. We don't put in place requirements, but we are coordinating the interagency group that from the California state agencies that's working on this. And some of our partners do have a regulatory role. So in terms of the environmental questions that we will be looking at, those will be considered by the Coastal Commission in its Coastal Zone Management Act consistency review. And they will be looking at holding hearings for both the Humboldt area and the Central Coast area coming up in the next spring and summer. And in addition to that, of course, Department of Fish and Wildlife is involved. State Lands Commission has jurisdiction over state lands, which are always going to be part of these projects, at least when you look at the transmission line coming to shore, as well as the ports discussion. In terms of the economic side of this, we do have a number of partners, including GoBiz and Workforce Development Board and Office of Planning and Research, but the Energy Commission under AB 525 is in charge of putting together a strategic plan for offshore wind that will look at this broad suite of issues. So we're doing our best. We realize it is a lot of agencies, but we are coordinating among our agencies. And while different agencies might be taking point on different issues, the state as a whole is working to communicate with California stakeholders, communicate with local governments, partner with BOEM effectively so that as this industry unfolds here in California, it does so in a way that is consistent with what the state of California and the residents of California would like to see. And so this is going to be an active process going forward in the next year. And I just really want to welcome and encourage public engagement in this process.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I just got an email from Christine Heinrichs, and she's kind of wondering, she said the onshore footprint for this is very large, or it seems very large. What will be involved in the feasibility study for this? That's going to bring us a lot of information. So I'm wondering if Melissa or Congressman Carvajal, you can address this.
I'm just wondering if Doug might be the person who might better touch on the feasibility. If you're referring to the feasibility study, I think that's, let me reframe that. The feasibility study would actually look whether a port is feasible. That doesn't really pertain to the footprint for the offshore wind farms. That would be part of the assessment that would be done through BOEM. In terms of the feasibility study that we discussed earlier, that pertains to the port issue. And that is something that, in terms of funding it, is the first step. And that's what the local stakeholders, local governments, and local community is considering right now, to be able to find out whether the feasibility of the port is possible. But in terms of the footprint of the actual wind farm, that is the NEPA environmental assessment that will take place and address any impacts and issues associated with that.
Thank you. Yeah, Doug, I don't know if you want to also address that.
Oh, and I'll just say to clarify, because I believe I heard the question was the onshore footprint.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, okay, so I can say, the congressman is correct. Offshore footprint, is something that we'll look at. And right now, we're looking at the wind energy area of 376, square miles. And, as we get the plans for these projects, once we get leases, then we'll see what the footprint is. But, I'll turn it over to the experts for the onshore footprint part.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and kind of a specific onshore impact, I guess, could be considered onshore is particularly residents of Cambria and San Simeon are concerned about their coastal views that they've worked their entire lives to get, to be able to afford a home in that area or work in that area. And so they're concerned how those view impacts may impact their property values. And so, Doug, I'm actually wondering if you can address how the potential viewshed impacts can be mitigated, perhaps.
Sure. And I'll just start off, Mackenzie, is that, as we went out with the call in 2018, the first time for Morro Bay, which essentially, the eastern boundary of the Morro Bay wind energy area, we did develop some visual simulations. So we have those on our website, and I think we have a point from San Simeon near the lighthouse where you can, where we have a simulation of what it would look like from shore. We went through, and did a full report on, what's out there, the weather conditions, the climate conditions throughout the year. So, to kind of give an idea of just how often they would be visible, to people standing on the beach there in the Central Coast. As far as the impacts to home values and property values, that's something that once we get an actual proposal on a construction and operation plan, that we can evaluate that in a NEPA document at that time, because it's kind of hard to tell because we don't know exactly where they're going to be, what size turbines, and if there are impacts, what kind of mitigations, it could be, some sort of lighting schemes on the wind farm that would reduce the light so you wouldn't see it as much at night, or, paint schemes to reduce the color. But those are things that are further down the road when we get to the EIS process for each of the projects.
Okay, got you. And so this question came from San Simeon resident Luz Hernandez. She's wondering, San Simeon is a disadvantaged community with a Hispanic majority. Do you think the placement of this project in San Simeon smacks of environmental racism? And Doug, I'm wondering if you can address that, and Congressman Carvajal as well.
I'll say again, I hate to, but that'll be something that we'll look at, in the future NEPA analysis. I did want to say that, any positive impacts that we can bring to disadvantaged communities is something that, this administration is wanting to do. One of the things that we're looking at is, how we can encourage the lessees out there so that they have projects that do benefit the local communities, and especially communities with, disadvantaged areas. So, that's something that we're looking at. We do take it seriously, and it's very important to the administration. But, the overall impacts, we'll address that when we get to the NEPA document at the construction operation plan phase.
I just would add that when you consider the crisis, the climate crisis, those that are most vulnerable are disenfranchised low-income communities and communities of color, quite frankly, when it comes to climate change and the impacts of climate change. So this is actually going a long way to address climate change and those impacts. But I think, as Doug said, I think this administration, and certainly I am, always concerned about environmental justice issues and making sure that no one community is disadvantaged in any way, shape, or form, but rather we have a positive impact in doing these types of projects, in working with communities to make sure that they are not disproportionately impacted in any way.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Congressman Carvajal, can you address exactly how you will be going forward with that to ensure that those communities aren't, of course, forgotten?
Well, I will tell you, I personally will be conducting a number of meetings and interfacing with my constituents, and I will be working with Doug and Bohm to make sure that their public process it continues to be very engaging, very transparent, and very robust, to make sure that everybody has a voice, that they can voice any concerns they might have, and that as we move forward in this process, that any concerns, valid concerns, are mitigated. I think everyone's committed to doing that. And like I said earlier, moving forward with this offshore wind effort will mitigate climate change, and the climate crisis, which right now disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color. So it would actually, right off the start, would help communities like the one we're talking about, but also making sure that we are mitigating any valid concerns and impacts.
Yeah, thank you. And so we're kind of bouncing around on topics here, but this question came from Tom Hafer. He's a local fisherman in Morro Bay. And he's wondering, can we install the wind turbines in phases to better understand their impacts before full implementation? And I think he's referencing all of the impacts that we've been talking about so far, and whether it's possible to kind of experiment before we go full force into this. And Doug, I'm wondering if you can address that first.
Yeah, I'll say that, I honestly, I think there will probably be a natural progression of how these projects go. As we're going through the process, we're still trying to determine, what areas are appropriate for leasing. So we're just at the wind energy area stage. How many leases is that wind energy area going to be when we get to a lease sale? So we're still figuring out those things. And, I think that I'll say that, once there are leases out there and once the construction operation plans are out there, depending on the number of leases, it's definitely, we've heard thus far that a 1 gigawatt project is, what would be economic for the floating, offshore the Central Coast. So, it's hard to say what a phased, if it's phased between the lease areas, or if it would be phased within a lease. It depends what the construction operation plan comes in. But I would expect that at the end of the day, the lessees are going to be looking to, have a 1 gigawatt project so that it could be economic and make economic sense for the state of California, who ultimately is deciding to purchase the power.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing you say is that there may be multiple companies. It's not going to be perhaps just one big company that comes in to lease the entire Morro Bay wind energy area. Is that correct?
Without being pre-decisional, I would say that that's a good assumption, yes.
Okay. And so how much public input would people have on those construction and operation plans if they see that a cable is running somewhere, or something that they would like to have input on? Can people comment on those construction and operation plans, or is that at the end of can you explain how that would work?
Right. So after we issue the lease, then the lessees will, do their survey work that they need to do to collect the data and information so that they could submit a construction operation plan. Once BOEM receives the plan, then we're going to start a full EIS for the evaluation of the plan, which will include, public comment opportunities, public outreach opportunities. So whatever is in that plan, the public will have an opportunity to comment on, and BOEM will take those comments into consideration, when making a decision on the plan.
Okay, thank you. And so this question came in from Ray Wayman. He's wondering, he's from Atascadero, and he's wondering how we're again bouncing around on some subjects here, but he's wondering how the Vistra Energy battery power plant will coincide with the proposed offshore wind energy development. And Karen, I'm wondering if you can address that one, perhaps.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, they aren't directly related, except that the battery storage technology is an important part of ensuring reliability, given our reliance on renewable energy, which is more intermittent. So you can't always get the electricity generated exactly when you need it. And in fact, solar generation falls off when people come home in the evening and start turning appliances on. And so we really need this energy storage in our system, and battery energy storage, including the proposal at the Vistra plant, which is just an example of that. It's rolling out at scale in California, and it's really helping us in terms of storing electricity when we have a surplus of renewables being generated and providing it when we need it. So with the offshore wind project, as Ben said early in this show, the production pattern is very different than solar. And in fact, we expect offshore wind to be producing more in the evenings and maybe less in the middle of the day when it's very hot. And so it'll complement solar very nicely, but then we will still need facilities like battery energy storage facilities that help us balance out these loads and make sure the electricity is there for us when we need it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so another question that somebody sent me was regarding specifically an environmental impact. And they're wondering, this is from Kim Ramos in Morro Bay. She's wondering, she hasn't heard anything about the effects to kelp forests off Cambria. Ben, perhaps you have any information regarding kelp forests, how those may be impacted from the impending offshore or the proposed offshore wind energy development?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing about kelp forests is that they are very close to shore, usually in less than 100 feet of water. So in very close, and these wind farms we're talking about something that's going to be a minimum of 20 miles out or more. So, the wind farms themselves are likely to be located very, very far from the kelp forest. So it's hard to imagine exactly how those wind farms might impact kelp forests directly. Obviously, there are the potential for indirect effects. If it changes wind patterns, that might actually change the wind along the coast to a small degree, which might have some small impact on upwelling. But I think it's unlikely that the wind farms where they are deployed are going to impact those kelp forests up in Cambria. Certainly, it's possible wherever those cables come ashore that might be some impact. But I will say the nice thing about kelp forests is that they are really dynamic systems, and when we get El Nino years or huge storms, it tends to reduce that warm water tends to reduce those kelp forests, and then when the water cools off, they come back. And so even if there was some sort of a short-term impact, I would expect that those impacts would be very, very short-lived, and probably in terms of the actual physical scope of the impacts was likely to be highly localized.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Congressman Carbajal, I understand that you have a plane to catch after the big vote this morning. You're going to be back in Santa Barbara. So thank you again for being here, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate being part of this symposium today. I want to just remind us, as I have to rush, that wind energy really allows us to meet multiple goals. One, address the climate crisis. Two, bring about renewable energy to meet our renewable energy needs and create jobs for the local community. I want to thank the Tribune for doing this. I want to thank DOD, BOEM, DOI, the White House, REACH, California CEC, and the local stakeholders for all the work that has gone into this and will continue to go into this. So with that, thank you for having me, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. And we've just got a few more questions for our panelists that are remaining. And so I'm wondering, this question actually came from Annie Roberts. She's a student at UC San Diego. And she says that it seems like some of the underwater transmissions lines may have to go through the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary or the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. She's wondering, how will this be addressed, and how are local native tribes such as the Chumash and Selenian tribes going to be included in this discussion? I'm wondering if Karen or Doug, you're able to address this.
Yeah, I think I'll take that one first, and I can say that if the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary proposal goes forward as it was announced, it would be very hard not to cross either the Monterey Bay or the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary with the transmission line to shore. I can say that, the BOEM team as well as the California team, we've been coordinating with the NOAA sanctuaries, since 2016. We've known this was coming, so we kind of have a plan for it, but it's definitely going to take some coordination between both, so to make sure that, everyone is aware and that we have a plan for a path forward. I can say from a BOEM perspective, we take our government to government responsibilities with the Sandy and Nesband, the Chumash Indians, very seriously. We've had consultation meetings with the tribe, and we will continue to do so, and they'll be involved in the process, all along the way to make sure that, their knowledge and that their thoughts are, shared with us, and that we can use that as we're basing our decisions in the future.
So I'll just add, from the state perspective, we also have consultation responsibilities with the tribes, and we've been working with BOEM on talking to the tribes and outreaching to tribes on offshore wind since the beginning of this process, and we're doing some of that outreach in the very near future as well together. In terms of the question about transmission, there's both the narrow question of cables to shore from these areas, these wind energy areas, but we will also be looking at broader transmission questions, and that could include undersea transmission that connects different parts of California. That's one of the options for, as we look at transmission, we will be looking at the possibility of an undersea cable that might connect from Diablo Canyon, for example, to the LA Basin. And that's a proposal that could have a lot of benefits in terms of bringing clean energy to this very high energy use and densely populated part of the state, where that could allow them to reduce dependence on some of the coastal natural gas infrastructure, and also charge all these batteries that we will be deploying throughout the state. So we're looking at similar proposals out of Humboldt as well. And so there is going to be some assessment of undersea transmission options going along with what potential upgrades in terms of land-based transmission might be needed at different scales for this industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And of course, we'll be following to see how that all develops. And so kind of one of the last few questions that I want to ask perhaps is a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of confusion, and obviously we are still very early on in the process for this potential development. And I'm wondering if each of you can kind of address perhaps misconceptions about this development that you've heard on your end, and what you would respond to those misconceptions. What should people know right now, essentially? And I'm wondering if each of you can address that. Whoever wants to start.
Sure, I'll start. And I'll say that, I think that, especially in the beginning, I think there were a lot of misconceptions out there, because when we first got the Trident Winds proposal, and, it used to, it was, the Trident project. And, we had to, kind of clarify that, because once we went into the competitive, there was no Trident Winds project anymore. It was just, we're planning for areas to lease for offshore wind because there's competitive interest in that area that Trident had proposed. So that was one. I think we've done a pretty good job at that so far. But, I think, one of the things is, there's not a project on the table. We're just in the leasing phase. We're still, although we've made progress, we're still kind of at the beginning. And, once we determine where the leases are, and how many lessees will be and who the lessees are, then it'll kind of start to solidify. And, especially once we get the construction operation plans in. So I think that, and another misconception is, and I think Karen talked about this earlier, is, we're still a long way from a project being in the water. And, if you think it's 2021 now, and we're probably not going to have a project in the water till, 2027 timeframe, probably the whole Morro Bay area not operational till the 2030 timeframe. That's still a long way away, but we've been at it for a lot of years, and we still got a lot of years to go. It will go fast, I think, but we are looking at the entire timeline still at the beginning before there's actual projects in the water.
Yeah, thank you. Karen, do you mind addressing the misconceptions that you've heard about this project?
I think what Doug said well is that I wouldn't even call it so much misconceptions as just a lack of experience with the BOEM process and the offshore wind process here, and the need to bring California stakeholders up to speed in order to understand what stage of the process we're at, what happens next, when can they get certain kinds of questions answered, when can they provide certain kinds of input. And we have conducted, back in the stage of identifying cull areas, we worked with BOEM and local officials to hold some public workshops and in the region, and both in the Central Coast and up in the North Coast in Humboldt. And we are in the process right now of thinking through what's the right kind of public engagement to help raise awareness and help people understand how to engage, when they can engage in this process. Because as Doug said, it is a long process. And right now we can talk about areas. We can talk about the planning coming up for a potential auction. We can talk about the technology, but we don't currently have, the developers aren't currently known. So we're doing our best to raise awareness and get input. And I also, again, want to encourage people to pay attention to the work that will be kicking off on the strategic plan AB 525, because that's another place where you can make your thoughts and concerns and preferences and ideas known to the state. And we always work closely with BOEM. So anyway, those are some thoughts from me.
Yeah, thank you. And Melissa, if you're able to address any misconceptions that you've heard or something that people should know.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's probably two things that I would note. One is, you hear sometimes that we're going to be the guinea pig. This is the first time this is happening. And I would say we're not. We're actually in a really great advantage in California that Europe and the East Coast are ahead of us. So you think of Europe, they have 26 gigawatts right now of offshore wind. And we're looking at, generating 30 by 2030 for the whole nation and 3 off of our coast. So when you think about our position, we have the great benefit of learning best practices that are happening in other parts of the world and making sure that it's done here well. And then the other misconception that I would say is that you hear, offshore wind and jobs talked about in connection a lot. And we know that offshore wind is going to generate jobs, no doubt. But where those jobs are and who actually is going to participate in the building of the offshore wind farms is still a question. And that comes back to what you've heard me share before as to where those jobs show up every day. So it's not a guarantee that the Central Coast is going to benefit in terms of jobs. That infrastructure question will have to be a part of the solution if we want to see the jobs here.
Yeah, thank you. And Ben, I'm wondering if you can also address some misconceptions that you've heard.
Sure. Thanks for that question. So, there are obviously lots, on the kind of the environmental impact side. First, people often think that these impacts from these wind farms are going to be large and they're going to be permanent and they're going to sort of, forever change our oceans. And, I think Melissa raised a great point that we are not the guinea pigs, that there are huge facilities that exist off of Europe. And so there's a lot that we can learn from those. In terms of, broadly environmental impacts, as the congressman and several other people alluded to today, we are in a climate crisis, and we are about to lose, Diablo Canyon is going to go offline, and, whatever the issues are with, potential nuclear power, that's 8 to 10% of California's electricity with no carbon emissions. And so we're going to have to find a way to replace that. And so just thinking about this from the scientific side, I do believe that we kind of need the all of the above solution, that to get to where we need to get to as a society, we're going to need that solution. And part of, what we don't want to do in the scientific community is provide as much, rigorous scientific information to help guide that process. So that means in some cases examining, impacts to seabeds, impacts to fisheries, potentially impacts to birds, and also trying to evaluate what the potential power generation would be, not just at a, annual average, but really thinking about this over shorter timescales. Like how much can it produce in the afternoons when that power demand and that need is highest. And so some of the ways we think about this are actually trying to pull all of this stuff together in trade-off analysis, really to think about, where are these places where the wind blows the most, where we're going to generate the most power, and where are some of these environmental impacts going to be highest and potentially lowest, and are there ways for us to find places or ways to sort of maximize the benefits of offshore wind power and minimize some of those impacts or some of those costs, try to find kind of those win-win in those places. And so, really just thinking about, I guess the misconception then is that we don't have enough information and that we don't have any ability to try to understand these things. And I would say that, that we do, and including the, as much rigorous science as we're including, like, Doug has mentioned with the NEPA process and the environmental impact assessments, really important to include as much of that information as possible. And also we have a huge opportunity that, there isn't any wind off of this coast, the entire West Coast, which is quite windy. And so it's likely that whatever we do in California is going to inform the process further up the coast, possibly in Oregon and Washington. And so we have this opportunity to generate those rigorous scientific data, that monitoring information to help us really understand how best to do this, not just here in California, but along the whole West Coast.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously I'll be following all that research to see what you guys find and so forth. Doug, I'm wondering, we have just a few minutes left. I'm wondering if you can, and you mentioned the scoping meetings that are coming up. I'm wondering if you can briefly explain how people can get involved in those and what best public comments you guys are looking for now that would help go in the stage of this process.
I'll say, I think there's an announcement going out soon, which is going to have the time, and they're going to be virtual. I believe there's one at the beginning of December and then another one at the beginning of January. But like I said, the details are being finalized, and we're going to go out with that announcement soon. Again, virtual. Really any comments of, anything that pertains to, lease issuance and, the assessment activities that are to go on, once we issue the lease, so that's the things that we're interested in right now. But, of course, any comments are welcome. And I can say that, I believe regulations.gov is out. So comments can be submitted now outside of those virtual meetings that we're going to have here in the near future.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's about all the time we have. We have about 2 minutes left. So thank you all. I really appreciate you being willing to participate in this panel discussion. It's a great discussion, and obviously there's still a lot to learn. So I will be continuing to follow this and so forth. So for those interested in learning more about this potential offshore wind energy development coming to our coast, please subscribe to the Tribune to follow all of my reporting as I continue to cover every twist and turn and the impacts and etc. of what happens with this potential project. And so the link to subscribe, obviously you can hopefully see it on your screen there. And with that, I will conclude this event. Thank you all again for attending, and I look forward to further covering this issue.